of the semester in the series of the Dean's series on law and policy, bringing the world into the law school. And I'm so delighted to be able to introduce Professor Heidi Brown, who's going to be talking about an issue that's very much in the news outside the law school, in the legal profession, and also inside the law school in terms of legal education. And I want to just give you a little tiny bit of background about Heidi, and then we're going to let her take it away. And there'll be, after her opening remarks with a few slides as an accompaniment, there'll be plenty of time for a conversation with the audience. So, Professor Heidi Brown joined the Brooklyn Law School faculty in 2016 as director of the legal writing program. She's made great changes and has unleashed lots of energy since she started, and we're all looking forward to continued progress in the future. Lots new going on with curriculum reform, with more legal writing, and with thinking about legal writing and legal education in many new perspectives. Before she came here, she worked in many different settings, one of which was a boutique firm that dealt with construction law. And I spent a little time this morning thinking somehow boutique and construction don't go in the same sentence, but they do. And that's just one of the many surprises and interesting factors. She's taught at other law schools, she's worked in other practices, she's an accomplished public speaker. And in addition to many of the articles she writes and teaching materials she prepares, she's written, I think now, 6 books. The most recent of which, Untangling Fear in Lawyering, is something that we'll hear about today, but I want to just mention a couple beforehand. In 2017, she published The Introverted Lawyer, and I keep thinking that somehow I'm going to, although not an introvert, I don't think I'm an introvert. I've learned a lot from reading that. I've also learned from her earlier books, The Mindful Legal Writer. She has several different books on that topic and under similar names. And then, of course, for those of you who know my passion for civil procedure, her Fundamentals of Federal Litigation is near and dear to my heart, and it's a great resource for students. So she's a varied person with multiple talents, and we're really happy to have her not only in the faculty, but as part of this series. Thank you all for coming, and I'm going to turn this over to Professor Heidi Brown.
Great. Thank you so much for having me and for all of you coming during this busy time of year. I love that we're talking about this topic today, mental health in the legal profession, and I'm thankful to Dean Fullerton because she really started this conversation here at Brooklyn Law School, at least as far as I'm concerned. It started really with our ABA president visit a couple months ago, and then on Monday we had our very first task force on law student and lawyer well-being meeting, which was very vibrant, and we got a lot of issues out on the table. So I'm going to sort of continue the conversation about that a little bit today and tie it to the research that I've been doing. So I wanted to start off talking about kind of misperceptions, okay? So when I first started researching really my own mental health and anxiety and issues around depression and stress in my legal professional life, I heard a lot of messages about how, well, law school just attracts stressed out people, right? Law school just attracts type A personalities. But when you really look at the research, that's actually not true. So I found this amazing statistic. The Dave Nee Foundation, if you've never looked at their website, it's a really good resource for tackling issues about anxiety, depression, other mental health issues in the legal profession. And these statistics come from the Dave Nee Foundation. Sorry. Already messing up here. Okay. When law students come to law school, the pool of applicants to law school reflects the same psychological profile or the similar psychological profile to the general public. So it's not that law school is attracting just more stressed out people. We reflect the same psychological profile as the general public. But the statistics that the Dave Nee Foundation have come up with are that by the end, by graduation, 20 to 40%, I know that's a pretty big range, but 20 to 40% indicate what they call a psychological dysfunction. I think that's pretty remarkable to think about. Over the past couple months, issues around mental health in the legal profession have jumped out in a lot of different publications. I just pulled 3 different articles since January. One in the American Lawyer, in which a lawyer at a big law firm wrote an article called Scared, Ashamed, and Crippled, talking about anxiety and depression. A month later, happens to be on my birthday, March 26th, a big law associate died of a drug overdose. There was research into whether it was a suicide. It wasn't, but it was a drug overdose related to stress. 2 days later, New York Law Journal, there's another article about a big law partner being really open about grappling with depression. So these issues are really, there's a trend towards starting to talk about them much more openly in the news, but it's definitely something that has been happening for a long time in our profession, that we haven't always been so open and transparent and vulnerable about sharing our own stories. And I mentioned those big law articles just because they tend to get in the newspapers. But as Dean Fullerton mentioned, I worked in a boutique, we called it a boutique construction litigation firm. It had 50 lawyers. Then I went to a big law firm in downtown Manhattan. And then the latter part of my professional career, I worked in another boutique firm with 12 lawyers. And I am telling you that these issues covered all three of those law firm experiences. So not to dwell on the negative too much, because what I want to talk about today is the positive and the changes that we as a community are already starting to talk about and that we can do something about. I've been really excited and encouraged that there are well-being initiatives going on in our profession. So I'll just list a few. If you were at the day that the ABA president came to visit us, I touched on some of these, but I'm going to just recap so we have some good news and we can get some momentum and keep going. So in 2016, a national task force on lawyer well-being was created. And I think it's remarkable that it's not just a couple people that got together and formed a task force. This was organized and focused and drew from a lot of constituencies in our profession. Various associations, as I listed up here, 17 judges, lawyers, and law professors came together to really analyze these issues and put data and statistics and research behind it. A year later, they issued a report. If you have never read that report, I highly recommend you do it. It really lays out practical, tangible issues that we know exist in our profession, but also a call to action. It's not just, oh yes, we know we have some issues. It's here's what we need to do about it, and we can't do it by ourselves. We have to come together. I love the quote that's in the task force report: to be a good lawyer, one has to be a healthy lawyer. And in my opinion, and having struggled with a lot of this throughout my several decades of a career, I never really focused on my mental or physical health. And I want for all our students in here to know that that's so important to start doing now. After that, working groups to advance well-being in the legal profession were established to really, as we all know, I mean, I'm so excited that our task force, we have about 65 volunteers so far. But we all know it's hard for 65 people to get in a room repeatedly and get stuff done. So the task force, the national task force, was thinking the same way. So they've broken into working groups to really start thinking about how can we make action happen without just talking about it. They've also established a well-being toolkit for the legal profession. I actually contributed to that. So it's these really cool, easy-to-follow checklists for if you've got issues like public speaking anxiety, for instance. I'm sort of the queen of public speaking anxiety. I have it myself. And so I contributed just a checklist to help law students and lawyers deal with really specific issues. But the toolkit has tons of different things that you can work on that affect your particular professional journey. They also, to make it even easier, they made a nutshell of the toolkit with 80 tips for lawyer thriving. So that's another sort of useful way to kind of see where you are with some of these issues. And then this is, I think, what I might be the most excited about. The task force established this campaign and pledge to kind of call again on stakeholders in our profession to kind of put their money where their mouth is and sign on to this pledge and be held accountable to this pledge about well-being issues in our profession and mental health campaigns in our profession. They've set out a 7-point framework, which I can share with you. I can send out some materials over that. And I checked this morning, and there are 94 signatories, big law firms, medium-sized law firms, and other big players in our profession. So just to touch on, we all know about a lot of the issues affecting mental health in our profession, but just to get really specific about it, the 2017 report actually builds on studies that were done in earlier years to identify issues with substance abuse, anxiety, stress, depression, things that some of us in this room are familiar with, dealing with lawyer suicide, which has become just a really sad and horrible trend, social alienation, work addiction, and sleep deprivation, which I think some of us in this room are experiencing right now. So my research and what I get really gung-ho about is trying to figure out why. And we can blame it on, there's tons of articles about, it's the billable hours structure, or it's the partnership track structure, or it's just law is hard and law is complicated. But I'm not satisfied with those responses. And also, yes, there's systemic or systematic things that we could change and that people talk about changing, but those things to me are kind of slow-moving trains. And I want to think about and research, and first of all for myself, but also to help my students, and then hopefully have a ripple effect into out there in the world. Why? Why are we struggling? Why do we have these mental health stressors in our profession? What does it really come down to? And I started researching, at least for myself, reflecting back on what was it about law school that made me feel stressed or anxious and led to depressive episodes? What was it about my 20-year litigation career in 3 different firms? And when I really started analyzing it, the theme that kept popping up was this notion of fear. And fear is not something that we talk about enough or very much at all in law school, and definitely in law school training. We pretend we're not afraid. And the message really is, I worked in these very aggressive law firm environments, and the message that I maybe misinterpreted, but I definitely perceived it was, you gotta act tough, you have to be confident, and just go for it. And if you're afraid, it's a weakness. So I decided, after I published my introversion book, I was doing some talks at a lot of different law firms, and I would have people come up to me and say, I'm not an introvert, I'm actually extroverted, but I'm really scared. I'm scared to go to court, I'm scared to take a deposition, I'm scared to make a mistake. And so when I really started digging into the notion of fear and researching the science of fear, I realized how prevalent fear is in our profession. And so we have a fear problem in our profession, but we don't really know what to do about it because we don't talk about it enough. So back in, I can't remember the actual date of this article in the American Lawyer, but it was earlier this year, there was another tragic death of a partner at the law firm of Sidley Austin, I think it was in California and LA. And this author, Vivia Chen, wrote this really, I think, powerful quote that just made me remember so much about my own practice. And again, not to be doom and gloom, I loved being a lawyer. I loved the research and writing aspect of my job. I loved the substantive part of my job. But there was this cloud of fear hanging over me for really 2 decades. And this quote kind of summed it up. You live in constant fear that you're going to make one mistake or one typo, or not be able to read the mind of the partner, and that's just engendering this daily sense of fear, and you're going to be sort of excommunicated from the profession. And that might sound a little dramatic, but I know personally that's how I felt, and many of my fellow associates felt that way, but we just didn't know what to do about it. It didn't seem like we could really talk about it. So transitioning also to thinking about fear in law school, I know that I was afraid in law school, and I know some of my students have experienced fear, but I was encouraged, at least, that the task force, the national task force, actually mentions fear 3 times in its report. And it talks about the fact that fear really does play a role in hindering law students from seeking the help that they need. And that's something that I think we can address as a community. Students fear jeopardizing their academic standing by coming forward. They worry about disappointing someone or feeling less than or being looked at as not worthy of law school. And I've heard many students, and this was brought up at the task force meeting too, what is it going to do for my career if I seek counseling or mental health counseling or admit that I'm worried? This I got from the Dave Nee Foundation website as well, and this really surprised me, but their studies show that 64% of law students will not seek professional help for mental health challenges. We know we have mental health challenges, but 64% of law students, at least in their survey, are afraid to ask for help. That's a problem. We have a problem. We have resources and solutions, but There's a disconnect there. And I know from personal experience in the last couple of weeks, I've been offering my own oral argument anxiety workshops, and I've had students say to me, I'm scared to actually come to the workshop about being scared because I don't want my classmates to see me. And again, it makes me sad. I'm like, oh, please come. It's the cone of silence, don't worry. But students are afraid to admit they are afraid. And that is something we need to do something about. So just reflecting back on my own past and talking to a lot of lawyers in New York and all over the country, really, about fear. I wrote a short piece for the ABA Journal about fear back, I think it was last year, and people confidentially started emailing me and saying, oh, wow, for the first time in my life, I feel like it's okay for me to tell just one person, and please don't tell anyone else, that I'm afraid. And these were the type of fears that lawyers were expressing to me. Fear of public speaking, which I can definitely relate to. Fear of going to court, being sort of looking stupid in front of a judge or the client. Fear of failure is huge. We are scared of making mistakes because the law is complicated and hard, and it's not always obvious what the right solution is. Fear of judgment is a big thing. I dealt a lot with fear of judgment, fear of criticism, which leads to shame, which is a whole other emotion. Fear of not bringing home the bacon, not being able to raise new clients, rainmaking, if that's an expectation for your partnership track. And what this kind of can play into is this imposter syndrome that a lot of us experience in the profession of, are we really cut out for this profession? We are cut out for this profession. We just need to learn how to untangle fear. So when I chose the word untangle for my new book because my whole life and professional career, I have been told, fake it till you make it. Just face your fears. It's fine. Everyone's afraid. If you're not afraid, it means you don't care enough. Being afraid just means you do care. And I've been using Instagram to promote my introversion book, and every day I feel like I see some sort of presumably inspirational message about if your dreams don't scare you, they're not big enough. Like, we have to be completely terrified in order to have dreams. And I've read this last quote a few times in really well-respected legal documents, treatises, guidebooks on practice. If you're not afraid, it's time to leave the law. And I just so disagree with that statement. I don't think we should have to be afraid to do our jobs well. Yes, I understand that fear can be a motivator, but I'm a strong believer that we should not have to be afraid to do our jobs well. And it's okay for us to say we are afraid and then figure out how to untangle that and really understand it. I've also gone to a lot of conferences. I go to a lot of legal writing conferences, which I love, and a lot of times we'll talk about pedagogy and the Socratic method, and I've heard on many occasions professors saying, well, cold calling or putting my students on the spot is the only way I can make sure that they're ready for class. And I've actually done research on that because my instinct is I don't believe that's true, but I didn't have the science to back that up. And in researching my book, I found many educational experts saying that if a student is afraid, really genuinely afraid, it blocks their ability because they're in that fight or flight mode. And there's science. It's not just me, Heidi Brown, saying it's fear. It really blocks our ability to perform. And so what we need to do as educators and as trainers in the law firm environment is help students unpack or untangle why they're afraid and help them and guide them through those moments, not let them off the hook, not say, oh, you can opt out, because I'm a big believer in we got to figure this out. But there's ways of making sure that the students and junior lawyers are not being blocked in a learning manner or in a performance manner by their fear. It's pure science that the fight or flight mechanism, it slows down your cognitive processing and ramps up your ability to protect yourself. And you can't process information or stimuli or respond to questions easily if you're in a complete fear state. So my process and what my new book talks about and my research talks about is instead of our profession sort of reinforcing messages of let's downplay fear, let's have bravado, let's just be confident, or just shrugging off fear, or acting like it's the world's greatest motivator, be afraid and do it anyway. I advocate for really getting to know and starting to have conversations in our profession about fear and how it's leading to mental health issues across our profession. So, like a good lawyer, when the problem or the solution to a legal problem is not readily apparent in our own precedent, what do? We argue by analogy. We research analogous situations elsewhere. So I was really struggling with, where in our profession can we find answers to this? How can we figure this out in our profession? And I kept running up into these sort of barriers. And so I started looking at what other professions are doing. I looked at what the medical profession is doing, journalism schools, engineering schools, and business and entrepreneurship training. And it was really fascinating. Now, I've been told, as I've started to talk about this, that all these industries have their own boatload of issues too. So it's not like we shouldn't feel that bad that we haven't figured this out, because these industries haven't quite done that perfectly either. But I learned in my research that there are things we can learn from some of these other professions and maybe start incorporating into legal education and legal training in the law firm environment. So the medical profession has actually written a lot of materials about these issues and have been grappling with these issues really for longer than I expected. So in 1999, the Institute of Medicine issued kind of a shocking report about the number of deaths in America from medical errors every year. And so the medical education community started analyzing that. Why are doctors making so many medical errors, or residents, med students making so many errors? And I want to say it was in like the 90,000 range, that many medical errors. People were dying from medical errors. And so the medical community started analyzing, well, how are we teaching? How are we teaching med students? And is that leading to mistakes? Is that leading to fear of asking the question? And in 2006, a lot was written about this, and they revealed this notion of the hidden curriculum. I had never, maybe that's a common term, but I had never heard that phrase before. And so the medical education community started analyzing what is this hidden curriculum, and they put on paper that it's sort of this culture of intimidation, a culture of fear. I was shocked when I realized they used the Socratic method in med school too, but it was the misuse of the Socratic method. And also this myth of the infallibility of the, quote, good doctor. Good doctors don't make mistakes. And so the medical profession started looking at, okay, why are we creating a teaching environment or a training environment in which junior doctors were afraid to point out mistakes if they were about to happen so they could deter mistakes, or they were afraid to admit a mistake that may have, if it had been remedied fast enough, could have prevented a problem. Also, to make ourselves feel a little better, this is not just in America. In Sydney and Melbourne in Australia, they were having the same issues with their way that they were teaching medicine. So solutions that the medical profession has started delving into is literally formal coursework to talk out loud, transparently, with vulnerability, with openness about mistakes and fear associated with making mistakes. And really talking between medical professors and with med students about having those difficult conversations. How do you say to a supervisor in a hospital, hey, I don't think you followed that protocol, or wait, I feel like this might be something else that we're overlooking. And so med schools were starting, again, I've been told they're not doing it perfectly, but at least they're trying to train medical students how to assert themselves and have the conversations that might cause a little bit of conflict with their teachers. And really teaching them about the concept of metacognition, how we learn, how we process fear when we're learning, and how we can talk about the fear of making a mistake. It's not going to end our career if we make a mistake. It could end our career if we never learn how to admit mistakes and process mistakes. And then med schools are experimenting with simulations and virtual reality technology to create safe learning environments where med students can experiment with mistake making, can sort of admit out loud, I'm afraid that I'm going to do the wrong thing here, and then experiment with making decisions, experiment with making the wrong decision, and then having sort of a decision tree from there. Okay, I made the wrong decision. How can I circle back and correct that and talk about that out loud without feeling a fear of judgment or fear of shame? So transitioning now to journalism schools, I came across this article by this professor in Ryerson University, which I believe is in Canada, and she was pointing out that journalism students are experiencing a ton of fear and fear of making mistakes right now as well. And I was really curious, what are they doing to help their students process fear, and what are the fears that journalists are experiencing that maybe didn't exist 5-10 years ago before the rapid fire news cycle, social media, and all of that. And so Professor Taylor was talking about this fear of being wrong, fear of missing deadlines, because the expectation is to get the story out so much faster than was the norm a while ago. And I was excited that Professor Taylor actually had a law degree, so she was already drawing analogies between journalism, education, and legal education, and saying that this culture of fearlessness, bravado, fearlessness contributed to well-being issues for journalism students as well. So she had started to experiment with mindfulness, but I think sometimes what we experience in the legal profession, legal education, is the worry that if we focus on concepts like mindfulness, and I disagree with this, but the worry is that if we focus on that, we're going to reduce the rigor or the intellectual rigor of school. And Professor Taylor was concerned about that too. So what they've been trying to do is really integrate these components into the regular curriculum so it doesn't seem like it's just an add-on or something like that. In the Thriving for Action program at this Ryerson University, they're intentionally talking about mistake making. So it doesn't become this scary thing to make a mistake, which I felt like coming up through law school and in my law practice, I was terrified of making a mistake because we never talked about making mistakes. The expectation was just don't make a mistake. Good lawyers don't make mistakes. But so what some journalism teachers are trying to head on address, we make mistakes. It's a fast-paced news cycle. We don't want to make mistakes. Here's how we can avoid them by talking, and here's how we can admit them, even though we might feel shame in doing so, and here's how to remedy them in a professional, ethical manner. I'll touch really quickly on the Columbia has a center, it's called the DART Center for Journalism and Trauma. I think it was Sophia at the task force that brought up this concept of trauma and vicarious trauma, that we certainly, as many lawyers, deal with and absorb vicarious trauma from their clients. And what these journalism schools are doing is directly teaching about the notion of trauma and how that can really have an impact on the journalists themselves. I'll touch quickly on engineering schools and entrepreneurship, and then sort of a proposal that I have, and then I'm happy to take questions. So engineering schools as well. I know engineering is more science-based, and mistakes are inevitable when you're inventing, but I thought there might be some nugget of information we could get from engineering schools about fear and mistake-making. And a couple schools, again, are designing courses directly around intentional mistake-making. So the engineering students get used to not being afraid of making a mistake and thereby avoiding risk or avoiding creativity just to do the safe thing, because that's not how inventions happen. And so they're establishing courses where students can experiment with something, not do it perfectly the first time, and then reflect on why it didn't work, and then try it again. And really exploring failure and fear and mistake-making as a method of learning, not just something that we want to avoid because it has bad consequences. Actually, if we talk about it more in the educational environment, we will be better armed to deal with the pressures in reality in life. In business entrepreneurship, I've really been intrigued by this concept, this very express and overt concept out there about the fail fast culture. And this CEO in Australia who goes around to businesses and helps them develop this sort of level of resilience in creative teams and businesses, talks about having a corporate culture in which you talk about failure and mistake making and fear and have an open, supportive environment, so then you can really kind of unleash people's creativity and solve problems instead of them just reverting to the way it's always been done because it worked before, so let's just keep going. And that doesn't really create innovation. And so she's really advocates this fail fast culture. There's a professor at American University who teaches a business course called Learn from Failure. I thought that could possibly be an interesting law school course too, where we look at mistakes that were made in legal cases or look at perceived, quote unquote failures and figure out, how can we as law students learn more about those issues related to difficult questions of the law. And what worries me in our profession is there's, especially with certain blogs and things that can be critical of lawyers when they make mistakes, we sort of have, especially with social media, have this level of shame. We sort of publicly shame lawyers for making a mistake or cut and pasting something into a document that gets accidentally filed. And I would like to advocate, instead of shaming lawyers for doing that, we actually help learn from it and help students understand how those mistakes can be made. And it shouldn't be devastating to someone's career if we can talk about it as a community. So my process that I write about in the book is really a 4-step process, and I can talk to you all individually about sort of the first 3 steps, which are steps that I take for myself to untangle my own fear towards performance, towards public speaking, towards any type of goal I set for myself. And I know that my resistance is really coming from a place of fear and conjuring up situations that I experienced in the law firm environment. So the first 3 steps are really what people can do interpersonally. But the 4th is what I think we can do here as a community, in cultivating a culture, a community of fortitude instead of a fear-based culture. There's actually a really good law review article by a legal writing professor named Abby Patoff at Chapman University, where I'm actually speaking tomorrow, and she talks about fear-based narratives and how we really need to be mindful of not using fear and catastrophic lawyering mistakes when we teach, which I've definitely done that because it's so dramatic to use a catastrophic lawyering mistake, but she writes about the harm that we can do to ourselves and our psyches when we look at mistakes as being catastrophic and instead start to look at mistakes as learning opportunities. And ideally, yes, we want to avoid them when we go out into the practice, but we can't do that if we don't know what they are and don't know how to anticipate them. So cultivating a legal culture of fortitude, I outline in some appendices in my book and sort of a proposed workshop or talking points for people who want to get together and talk about untangling fear and lawyering that can help us address a lot of these mental health issues and the toll that it takes on law students and lawyers when we don't address fear, is really starting to start having conversations around it. Understand the science of fear. What really happens to a student when they're cold called or in the hot seat in class, and as educators, really educating ourselves more about how to help a student through that scenario and making it a positive learning experience really for everyone in the room. There was a great Twitter post by a law student who actually said out loud, I can't remember what school it was, you guys probably know, but about a student who said in class to the teacher, I am prepared, I'm just freaking out right now, or I'm really nervous right now. And I think it got, 300,000 retweets or likes or whatever the term is. And to me, that just kind of sums it up, that the student was able to say out loud in class, I really am prepared and I want to stay in this moment, but I'm terrified, so work with me here. And I think that's a great learning moment. Psychological safety is another term that's being discussed. Professor Amy Edmondson, who's from Harvard, just wrote this great book called The Fearless Organization, and it's about how to cultivate a culture where we diffuse fear in order to facilitate team building, collaborative learning, collaborative working, innovation, and really trying to understand, are we accidentally stoking fear, and what can we do to diffuse that and really take ownership of things that we might not even realize that we're doing. Also just empowering law students and junior lawyers to open up and say, I'm scared to go take this deposition. And it's definitely hard. I know how hard it is to admit to a supervisor or a partner, a scary partner, I'm scared. But I'd love to cultivate scenarios in law firms where it's okay to say, hey, I have to go negotiate this settlement agreement or this contract with opposing counsel, and they're kind of intimidating. How do I prepare mentally and physically? Not substantively, I know how to prepare substantively, but what can I do when I walk in the room instead of just trying to mirror someone else's fear-based narrative behavior? How can I really own myself mentally and physically? And then I'll touch on really quickly trauma-related fears. At my research, I hadn't intended to talk so much. My book was really intended to talk about law students and lawyers, but it inevitably led into client fears. And it taught me that I need to do a better job of actually thinking about the fears that clients experience. And in our law school classrooms, start talking about, okay, how do we recognize client fear? Is it in resistance? Is it in the way they're looking at me or not looking at me? Is it in the way they are not giving me information that I need? And really trying to understand where client fears are coming from so then we can help them and build the lawyer-client relationship. Trauma-informed lawyering, I think, is something. I know a lot of clinics are already doing this, and I know Dean Fullerton and I think Dean Kaplow also have dealt with trauma-informed lawyering in the immigration realm and other ways of having people who, like from hospitals, who deal with trauma victims, trauma survivors. But I think we can do more of that in law school as well, and these three law professors have written articles about that in the Clinical Law Review. So that's really, in a nutshell, my approach to addressing mental health in the legal profession by digging down to the why. And for me, the theme of fear just kept resonating. And so that's just been my area of focus for this project. So I'm happy to answer any questions or foster a little bit of conversation.
Great. Thank you. So we're going to have a conversation, and I'm going to first go to the seats in the room. So we probably have microphones I can bring around.
I'm Lance, I'm a 1L. I'm one of Professor Brown's students. So I recently discovered the term hidden curriculum as well. And I was wondering if you think that it's just a byproduct of the stress culture of these kind of higher educations, or if you think that it's an intentional thing that drips down from kind of people that feel as if they had to go through it, so now younger students have to go through it as well.
I think it's a little bit of both. I think certainly we do what we know, and I know I did that when I started teaching 10 years ago. I did what my professors did, and then I realized that I needed to sort of have my own style. And also I needed to change because my students were a different generation than I was when I went to law school. And you all are dealing with so many pressures that, we had to deal with a lot of pressure, but different pressures. Like you have to deal with astronomical debt, social media in your face on many levels, a much more volatile political cycle. I mean, we go outside and so many things are happening to your generation of law students that we had to deal with political strife, but not 1/100th of the degree that your generation is. So for me as an educator, I realized I didn't train in being a teacher, I trained in being a lawyer, and so I'm just trying to learn even now. I mean, sorry that I don't know exactly what I'm doing yet, but I want to make sure I'm trying to change and not just do what my professors did because it worked for them. So I think it's why being part of a law school is so amazing, because we do have teaching workshops and we do talk about these things. Faculty do talk about these issues a lot, and because we're all dealing with a ton of pressures ourselves, even as faculty members, we don't always execute it as quickly maybe as we could. But so to answer your question, I think it's partially that we do what we know as educators, and also I do think our profession has this culture of presumed strength and power, and it's hard, and it should be hard. I mean, we're doing hard work. It's noble work, but it's tough. And so I think we've approached it over century as we should make it rigorous. And I definitely agree it should be rigorous, but I think it can be rigorous and humane at the same time.
Great. Other comments, questions? I saw Professor Capers' hand up, so while you're overcoming your fear of asking
So this has been great. I'm actually going to try to sneak in 2 questions,
Okay.
if you don't mind. With respect to anxiety and stress and being afraid, you really spoke about the negative, but I imagine there are also positive, constructive ways of constructive effects to being under stress or anxiety, especially as a lawyer. So can you talk a little bit about knowing the difference?
Yes.
And then the second question, sort of, I'm still intrigued by the reports you mentioned early on, and it almost, the emphasis almost seemed to be on the people who are experiencing mental health issues rather than on the partners or the professors who might be exacerbating the problem. So I'm wondering if there's anything in the report or any recommendations for how, partners, law professors, whoever, cannot be part of the problem.
Yes. Okay. So my introverted brain is already confused by the 2 questions. I'm going to start with the first one, which is on. So the second one is really what the professors and the partners can do, and the first one is on how to process maybe the positive aspects of anxiety and stress and fear. So yes, some of the motivational messages, I definitely heard, use your fear. Fear is a great motivator, and anxiety is good because it makes you work harder. And what I'm trying to do and what I do in the book is definitely distinguish positive aspects of anxiety and stress and even some fear, and then the destructive aspects of it. And for me, it started with giving myself permission to not buy into the messages that just face your fears, everyone's afraid, it's fine. Well, my fear was debilitating. And so I had to really, for myself, understand, okay, my intrinsic motivation is a good thing. I want to do well, I don't want to look stupid, I want to succeed, I want to please my boss or impress my professor. But when it starts to block my ability to answer a question in class or do the oral argument, my oral argument in law school was a disaster. And so I knew the difference was once it changed from me just being motivated to me being really debilitated almost, I had to realize, okay, that part is bad, and I need to be able to understand what I'm doing mentally and physically that's pushing me to that side. So the steps 2 and 3, so the first, my process is really the first 3 steps of my 4-pronged process. The first is realizing aspects of your personal life in which you don't have anxiety and you're not stressed and you feel powerful, not afraid. So for me, I kind of joke around in the book that when I go take a boxing class, for instance, I'm not afraid, but why am I afraid in a faculty meeting or in a class or like coming in here today? What's the difference? And then mentally, the messages we tell ourselves. I know students, when they walk into our classrooms here, it's not really that they're afraid of that professor or that student chuckling if they get the answer wrong. It's messages we've ingrained in our minds for decades. At least for me, it was decades. It was, an elementary school teacher that made a comment, or a coach, or an authority figure. I grew up in a pretty religious family, and so church advisors. And so we're dragging that into every classroom. And so realizing when it's that kind of motivation, negative prodding, that's not effective, and having to delete that soundtrack and start something new. The physical part is huge, though, too. So I realized that I carry a lot of my stress, anxiety, and fear in my physical body, and everything I was doing when I would go to class is hunch down, be really small, and that was blocking energy, blood, and oxygen flow. So I had to learn, okay, when I'm in the classroom, I didn't know this at all when I was in law school, but I know now if you sit in a balanced seated stance, so say that Professor Capers is going to call on you, you realize you're hunching down, you're bracing for the fight, not the fight, but the flight. Open up, sit back, and there's physical things you can do to take that adrenaline rush and turn it into a positive. So those are kind of things to help you distinguish the destructive from the constructive. The task force report really does a great job of not just putting it all on the individual at all, but calling upon all the stakeholders in our profession, law professors, deans of law schools, law firm partners, corporate counsel departments, judges too, because there's a lot of that happens in the courtroom that isn't so great either, although a lot of judges are making huge efforts to diffuse some of the fear in the courtroom. But the task force calls upon all those stakeholders. They call it reduce the toxicity in our profession. And so those are the conversations people are having, not about reducing the rigor at all, not about making the law just easy and happy and rainbows and sunshine, but understanding what is driving toxicity and what we as leaders can do about it.
Thank you. I know we're coming up on the next class hour, but other comments, suggestions, thoughts? So let me take the dean's prerogative while I'm waiting for you to come up with a question and ask Heidi. This is too big a question probably to answer, but having had the good fortune of spending sabbaticals doing research for year-long trips and living in other countries, I'm struck by the very different, at least work cultures there are in the United States compared to, say, my experience in Spain or Italy. And I wonder, I know your book, and we all are living in this culture, we're trying to respond to it, but it seems to me the cultural expectations and rewards are such a big part of this. It's hard to think of how to even be successful within a culture that does reward such hard work and stress.
Yeah, I mean, we as Americans, we are driven, and we're driven by these external motivations and rewards, and the law firm world is sort of structured that way. We want to make partner, and we all want to earn a living and pay our rent and all those sorts of things, but I think you're right that the way just traditionally it's been set up is not the healthiest way of practicing law and being a really robust contributor to the legal profession. We run ourselves ragged, and it's like a badge of honor. And so I think what this task force is trying to do, and what the stakeholders and all the signatories to that pledge are trying to do, is look at how can we still achieve excellence and bill lots of hours and please our clients and win cases. How can we do that, but at the same time be humane employers and good leaders and nurturing trainers and mentors? We can do both. And I read a great book by Ed Catmull, who I think was the co-founder of Pixar Animation, and just looking at how other industries have been able to achieve greatness in innovation and creativity. We, as lawyers, we can be innovative and creative. We just haven't learned or focused on how to get the most out of our employees, because our model is go, 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 bill as much as you can, and win, and win, win, win. But I think more people are starting to look at, how does Google do it? How did Pixar do it? How do these companies who aren't in the legal world create teams that value individuality, value introverts and extroverts, value the gregarious, go-getting rainmaker, but also the good brief writer? I don't think our profession has put enough thought into that, but they're starting to, and that's great. And then also, I taught in Italy as well, and I had my own misconceptions about, or stereotypes there, and I thought, the Italians, they're so relaxed and have a great lifestyle, and I was going to have my students do an oral argument, and I offered up my anxiety workshop thinking no Italian student would need my anxiety workshop, and sure enough, there were several students that said, I'm terrified of my oral exams, and we don't talk about it at all here. So I don't think that these issues are unique to America, but I do think that other countries and other industries have put more thought into how we can be amazing and impactful and productive and successful and excellent, but also be healthy.
Okay, other questions, thoughts? So, Kate, Professor Mogilescu, can I ask you a question as this can be the final question, but in your work, you've dealt with a lot of clients that have dealt with lots of fear, and I just wondered if you could offer any thoughts or observations from that aspect.
Sure, and I was glad that you came around to that in your talk today about thinking about this from multiple roles and perspectives. Oh, yes, of course. And thinking about this from multiple roles and perspectives, because particularly for lawyers working with clients, recognizing our fear and how our fear impacts us is one thing, but doing it in the other direction as well. I'm interested in, and I think running through my brain as you were talking is also thinking about some of the race, class, and gender aspects of this, and how those impact not only fear, but interpretation of behavior. Because a lot of this is how your behavior is interpreted. And for clients, particularly, at least the clients that I work with, they're constantly scrutinized by legal systems and by individuals, but I can't help but think about how race, class, gender, all of that impact the analysis. And so I don't know, maybe I can turn the dean's question to me into a question for Professor Brown. That would be a very skilled way to deflect the question, which is what I'm maybe going to do right now. So in the work that you're doing, how have race, class, and gender kind of been woven in?
So gender has come up just in my introversion, extrovert, well, actually that's not true. All of that has come up in my introversion, extroversion research, and also in terms of people who will seek help for, not that I think people need to seek help for introversion, but seek advice when they have to go to a performance-oriented event and they're nervous. So I've done my oral argument anxiety workshops for 5 years now at 2 different schools, and it's usually women and people from different disadvantaged backgrounds that will come to the workshops, whereas mostly men or men who haven't experienced disadvantage in their backgrounds don't come. And I don't think it's because they don't experience the anxiety and fear towards the oral arguments, for instance, but they don't want to self-identify that way. But also culturally, I've had a lot of students who are nervous about speaking in class or doing oral arguments because culturally they were brought up, like I was, in either a very religious environment where you were expected not to assert an opinion that differs from your elders or your superiors, and I really struggled with that. I mean, my dad's an Episcopal minister. It wasn't like I grew up in this particular culture, but for me, I got to law school and didn't feel like I was entitled to have an opinion because I wasn't used to expressing an opinion that differed from a superior. And so I've found in talking to students from different cultures who come to law school in the United States, that's definitely something that they grapple with. Even if they're extroverts in their particular home environment, they come to our law school classrooms and sort of introvert themselves when they have to assert opinions. And I've just found in terms of self-identification or asking for help, it's usually more female students that do it and students of other races that do it. On the client side, I just want to touch on that real quick. I haven't, my research sort of touches on the client side, but in terms of teaching us as lawyers, or teaching ourselves how to identify, we don't have psychology degrees, obviously, or many of us don't have psychology degrees, I don't. But there are things that we can learn about how to communicate with clients as clinic students, as externs, in our summer jobs, of how to really pay attention to a client's body language. You know, I share a lot in my books that I have a blushing response. You know, are you noticing someone getting hot? Are they sweaty? That could signal fear, anxiety. Shame is a really big deal for clients that I've found in my research. And they're scared of us. And so how can we as lawyers not invoke more fear in them, but help to diffuse the fear so then they can perform the way they need to, so they're not judged based on gender, race, other issues, which of course that's going to happen, but what we want to do is try and eliminate all these different layers and barriers to getting justice for them. And emotion is a huge factor. For a lot of us, you know, the law can be very stressful when you're the focus of it, and so teaching ourselves as lawyers to recognize, not be afraid to recognize emotion, not be afraid to talk about emotion, not be afraid to talk about fear, shame, anxiety, and all of those things, I think can help especially when gender and race are an issue, making them feel heard, a sense of belonging, a sense of really listening, that we are advocates for them.